The first drop of water felt like fire. Steam rose thick around us, turning the air into a white blur of fear. No one moved. Some shouted. Others whispered prayers that melted into the hiss of pipes. I stood frozen, waiting for death to come in a form we'd never imagined, clean, efficient, and silent. The men around me trembled, their eyes wide, their breaths sharp with panic. For a moment, I believed the Americans would kill us here, not with bullets or blades, but with water. Someone screamed, "Gas!" in broken English, and that single word struck every heart like a whip. My hands clenched, my chest tightened. I was ready for pain, for the burning that never came. Instead, the heat wrapped around me like a living thing, and through the blur of steam I saw nothing but lines of frightened men, stripped of rank, pride, and certainty. My name is Commander Toshiro Hayashi of the Imperial Japanese Navy. I had survived the guns of Okinawa, the roaring skies, the endless bombardments, but I was not prepared for this. The sound of the showers echoed through the wooden walls, water striking the floor in steady rhythm, a sound so normal it felt cruel. The Americans shouted orders we could not understand, their voices lost in the noise. Soap slid across the floor. A soldier beside me rubbed his arms as if expecting his skin to peel away. I waited for the sting of poison, but none came. Only the warmth, real warmth, clean and pure, washing down my back, across the scars and grime that months of battle had carved into me. I opened my eyes and saw the faces of my men, some trembling, others still frozen like statues, and realized we were not dying. The fear in me began to loosen, replaced by a kind of shame I could not name. I thought of the weeks we'd spent hiding in the caves of Okinawa, drinking muddy water, our uniforms stiff with salt and blood, our skin crawling with lice. Now, under the hands of our enemies, we were cleaner than we had been in years. I felt the dirt leave my skin like a confession. The heat eased the ache in my shoulders, and for a heartbeat I felt almost human again. But that sensation hurt more than any wound. Around me the steam thickened, swallowing our shapes until we were no longer soldiers, just men, breathing, blinking, alive. The sound of running water became almost peaceful. I remember thinking, if this is death, it is strangely kind. But it was not death that came for us that day. It was civilization. When the showers stopped, silence filled the room again. Steam clung to our faces as guards handed out thick towels and piles of clean clothes. The fabric felt strange in my hands, soft, dry, smelling faintly of chemicals. Each man received a bar of new soap, pale and neatly wrapped in paper-stamped US Army. The Americans moved with a rhythm that seemed almost mechanical. They spoke few words, but everything moved with purpose. One soldier pointed, another recorded names, another collected our old uniforms without emotion. There was no shouting, no cruelty, just an efficiency that made me uneasy. Back in Okinawa, nothing had been this precise. Orders came through chaos, radios failed, men fought half-blind in smoke and noise. We believed passion and will could overcome any disadvantage. But here, even in a prison, order ruled everything. How we lined up, how we dressed, how we breathed. I watched a young guard fold the towels into perfect squares before stacking them, as if symmetry itself were a rule. The sight unsettled me more than anger ever could. In our army, perfection was demanded by fear. In theirs, it was achieved through habit. I began to sense a different kind of strength, one that didn't shout or threaten. The Americans treated time like a weapon. They measured it, controlled it, used it to keep the camp alive and the chaos out. As we stood in rows, wet and shivering, I realized that this was how they had won the war. Not through fury, but through system. They didn't just build machines, they became machines, each man knowing his place, his task, his rhythm. Watching them, I felt the weight of my own nation's disorder. We had fought with spirit, but spirit cannot fix a broken radio or feed a starving soldier. Around me, my men avoided my eyes, too proud to admit the same thought. We had called the Americans soft, indulgent slaves to comfort, yet even here in captivity, they moved with a quiet discipline we could never match. The water had washed the dirt from our bodies. Their order now stripped the illusions from our minds. Okinawa still lived in my skin. The smell of mud, rot and smoke never left me. The ground there was not earth anymore. It was flesh and ashes mixed together by endless rain and artillery. I remember the stench of the wounded, the flies crawling over open wounds, and the screams of men buried half alive. Water was rarer than mercy. We rationed it drop by drop, boiling it black with soot, drinking from puddles that shimmered with oil. One drop for the tongue was worth more than a man's life. We fought for weeks without washing, our uniforms stiff with dried sweat and salt. I remember rubbing mud on my face to hide the smell of decay, because clean skin made you stand out to death. The jungle heat was merciless. Men collapsed, their bodies covered in ulcers, their eyes glazed with fever. Disease spread faster than bullets. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers died on that island. Many not from combat, but from infection, dehydration, and rot. We endured filth as proof of loyalty. The filth became our armour. The smell of death was the perfume of duty. We were taught that pain was honour, that to ignore the body was to serve the emperor. In that belief, we lost the very thing that made us human. Every morning, I woke to the sound of coughing, the rasp of flies over the dead, and the slow dripping of rain through broken helmets. The mud was everywhere, in our mouths, under our nails, inside our wounds. When I stood under the American showers, I thought of that mud again. It clung to memory like a scar that could never heal. We had believed purity came from dying clean, not living clean. That single thought, so noble at the time, now felt like madness. The Americans, in their strange order, had turned cleanliness into a law. For us, it had been a luxury, a weakness. On Okinawa, we worshipped endurance. In captivity, I was beginning to understand survival. The next day, fear returned to the camp like a fog that never lifted. Men whispered as they lined up for the showers, their voices thin and broken, carried on the wind like ghosts. Some said the water was poisoned. Others swore it was an experiment, a trick to see how long we would last. We had heard stories, half-truths carried from Europe, about gas chambers where prisoners walked in to die. Now, standing before the same rows of pipes and drains, those whispers grew teeth. Fear spread faster than steam. Every hiss of water made someone flinch. A soldier near me rubbed his arm raw, convinced the soap would burn his skin. Another refused to enter at all until a guard shoved him forward. I felt the same chill crawl up my spine. The Americans gave no explanation, only gestures and orders in a language that sounded cold and final. We could not understand them, and they did not understand our terror. The air was thick with the scent of metal and soap, and every drop of water echoed like a bullet hitting the floor. I saw one man close his eyes and mutter his last prayer before the pipes came alive. But again, there was no pain, no gas, only warmth and the steady sound of water. Our translator, a quiet man who spoke broken English, shouted over the noise, "No gas, just shower, clean." He pointed at the guards, at the soap, at the drains, desperate to calm us. The guards stared, confused by our fear, not realizing that we'd been told all our lives that capture meant death. I looked around and saw faces half hidden in steam, trembling, waiting for betrayal. But as the minutes passed, the panic began to fade, replaced by heavy silence. The water fell in smooth rhythm, washing away not only dirt but something darker, the lies we had carried. The fear that had gripped us for so long began to unravel. I realized then that the Americans were not trying to kill us. They were teaching us to wash, to follow rules that seemed absurd to men who had spent years fighting in filth. It was not mercy, but method, a discipline we did not understand. For the first time I began to see that their power came not from cruelty, but from control. Days began to fall into a rhythm that felt almost military. Each morning or evening, depending on the schedule, the guards lined us up in rows outside the shower hall. No one spoke. We waited for the sound of the whistle that signalled it was time. Soap was handed out, small square bars stamped with the mark of the US Army, and we moved forward step by step like a silent procession. The Americans watched carefully, ticking boxes on their clipboards, counting heads, checking towels. Everything was measured. Timed, efficient. We were told that prisoners were to bathe 2 or 3 times a week, inspected by medics, dusted with white delousing powder afterward. They treated hygiene not as kindness, but as a rule. To them, Hygiene was discipline. We learned to undress, to wash, to dry, and to dress again without hesitation. The routine became mechanical, yet strangely comforting. There were no surprises, no shouting, no chaos. Even the water arrived with precision, turned on and off by the clock. At first, I thought this was another way to break us, to strip individuality from men already defeated. But as the days passed, I began to see the order hidden beneath. The Americans believed that cleanliness was a kind of obedience, a small act that kept the body and mind in line. In their world, soap replaced punishment, a schedule replaced fear. Each man, clean and silent, became part of a pattern that no one dared disrupt. I noticed how the guards themselves followed the same rhythm. They moved on time, ate on time, inspected on time. It was as if their entire country marched to an invisible drum. I had once believed that strength came from devotion and sacrifice. Now I was beginning to understand that theirs came from consistency, from rules followed not by fear, but by habit. The Japanese army demanded discipline through pain. The Americans built it through repetition. And in that repetition, there was power. When I looked at the long rows of prisoners stepping forward, scrubbing their arms, rinsing their hair, I no longer saw shame. I saw order. I saw a reflection of a nation that had mastered control not by the sword, but by the soap. In their cleanliness, I saw the reflection of a nation built on order. Weeks passed, and the changes came quietly, like a tide that no one noticed until it surrounded us. The coughing at night began to fade, the endless scratching of lice disappeared, and the smell of rot that once clung to the barracks slowly vanished. The medics walked among us with clipboards, checking wounds, inspecting skin, making notes with calm precision. They said nothing, but their work spoke for them. Our sores healed faster, our coughs eased, and even the deep cracks in our feet began to close. The powder they used left white traces on our clothes, but it killed the insects that had tormented us for years. Infection rates, they said, had dropped by nearly 80%. We didn't understand the numbers, but we felt the truth in our bodies. I slept longer and deeper than I had since the war began. For the first time in years, I woke without the ache in my chest or the fear that something inside me was rotting. Even as prisoners, we were healthier than as soldiers. The irony was cruel and impossible to ignore. Every morning, when I touched my healed skin, I felt both shame and gratitude. Shame that it was the enemy who had restored me, and gratitude that I was still alive to feel it. Some men grew curious instead of bitter. They whispered about the strange American powders, about the routines that never changed, about how everything they touched seemed to work. We started to look at the guards differently, not as monsters, but as people who lived by rules that somehow made life easier. Still, the contradiction gnawed at me. How could a nation capable of so much destruction also care so precisely for its captives? I tried to hate them as I had been taught, but hatred could not survive where health returned. At night, when the barracks grew quiet, I listened to the steady breathing of my men and realized how rare silence without pain had become. The war had taught us to equate suffering with strength, but here, in this strange order of our captors, comfort came without weakness. I didn't know if it was kindness or calculation, but it worked. My body was healing, and my pride was breaking piece by piece. It happened slowly, almost without notice. What began as a forced routine turned into something we quietly awaited. The whistle that once brought dread now carried a strange relief. Men began to prepare early, folding their towels neatly, lining up before the guards even called. Some joked softly about the temperature of the water, about whose soap lathered better, about how long the hot water would last. We began to talk about soap, about water temperature, as if it mattered. I caught myself joining in, laughing faintly at the same jokes, and the sound startled me. I, a commander of the Imperial Navy, once proud of surviving hunger and mud, now found myself anticipating a shower. The shame burned deeper than any wound. I tried to remind myself that we were prisoners, that every comfort was meant to weaken us, to make us forget who we were. But the truth was harder to swallow. The Americans didn't need to torture us. They had something far more powerful: comfort. It crept under our skin, softening us where pain never could. Clean clothes, warm meals, the predictability of routine, they began to dull the edge of defiance. I saw it in the way the men walked back from the showers, their heads lower but their steps lighter. They spoke of the guards with grudging respect, even curiosity. The hatred that once burned so easily was now cooling, replaced by confusion. I wanted to despise them, to keep my pride intact, but each day the lines blurred further. How could I hate the man who handed me soap, who made sure the water was warm, who saved me from infection? The contradiction was unbearable. We had been trained to endure suffering as proof of loyalty, but here survival demanded acceptance. In the silence of the barracks I wrestled with that truth. The comfort was not mercy, it was control. It was a weapon that disarmed us without violence, made us compliant without fear. I watched my men polishing their boots, tidying their bunks, obeying without orders, as if the discipline of the enemy had seeped into their bones. And I knew then what truly broke us. It wasn't the war, nor the defeat, nor the cages around us. It wasn't the war that broke us. It was comfort. Over time, I began to understand that what surrounded us was not mercy but structure. The Americans followed rules as if they were scripture. Everything had a procedure, a checklist, a reason. Hygiene, I learned, was one of the 3 pillars of their prisoner management system, along with food and order. It wasn't an act of compassion, it was policy. They treated hygiene not as kindness but as command. Every action in the camp, from how meals were served to how showers were timed, followed regulation. Even the smallest details, like where we hung our towels or how we folded blankets, were inspected and corrected. To them, cleanliness was not decoration. It was discipline, and that discipline reached beyond the body. It shaped the mind. I began to see that the Americans were not simply strong because of their weapons or machines, but because of their system. They didn't rely on emotion or faith, they relied on process. While we in Japan had worshipped the spirit of Bushido, devotion, sacrifice, endurance, they had built something colder but more enduring, order. Their strength didn't come from dying for their nation, but from maintaining it. They ruled not with fear, but with habit. Watching them, I realized that even their compassion had rules. Their doctors didn't heal us out of pity, but because procedure required health. Their guards didn't strike out of anger, because discipline forbade it. It was a civilization built on self-control, where even kindness was measured. The thought unsettled me. I had once believed that honor was born from passion, from the willingness to suffer. But here I saw another kind of honor, one born from precision, from men who obeyed not out of terror, but from trust in their own system. That was their true power, and perhaps our greatest weakness. One morning after a night of rain, I stepped outside the barracks and saw a shallow puddle glimmering in the dirt. The sky was grey, the ground soft beneath my boots. I bent down without thinking and saw my reflection staring back at me. For a long moment I didn't recognize the face in the water. The grime was gone, the beard trimmed, the scars fading into pale lines. My skin looked almost new. But my eyes were older. They had seen something I couldn't name. I realized the enemy had given me back something my own army took: dignity. Not through kindness or pity, but through order. It struck me that America and Japan had been fighting 2 different wars. We believed victory came from endurance, from sacrifice, from the willingness to suffer. They believed it came from structure, from systems that worked whether men loved or hated them. We called filth endurance. They called cleanliness strength. In their world, a man didn't prove his honor by surviving hardship, but by maintaining it. They fought chaos with organization, fear with routine, despair with precision. I began to see that the strength of a nation was not written in blood, but in its discipline. The Americans had built a civilization where care itself was a form of power, where order replaced emotion, and even defeat could feel clean. I touched the surface of the puddle, and the image rippled, breaking into pieces. For a moment I saw my face dissolve into the grey sky above it, as if the man I had been was slipping away. I thought of my comrades who had died believing that dirt and hunger were symbols of honour. They never lived long enough to know that cleanliness could be its own kind of courage. The realization filled me with a quiet sorrow. Perhaps we'd not lost to America's weapons, but to its way of living, to its belief that progress could be built from routine, not sacrifice. I straightened up, feeling the damp air on my skin, and understood that something inside me had changed forever. The war had stripped me of rank, pride, and freedom, but it had also shown me the cost of our blindness. Many years after the war, when the noise of memory had faded to a dull echo, I returned to Japan. The cities had changed, cleaner, quieter, rebuilt from ash. I was an old man then, slower, greyer, but still haunted by the sound of running water. One winter evening, in my small home in Yokohama, I turned the handle of a new hot water tap, the kind installed in every modern house. Steam rose from the sink, curling like ghosts of the past. The sound of water reminded me of defeat, and of what victory really meant. It wasn't the sound of surrender, but of understanding. As the warmth filled the room, I thought back to that first shower in the American camp, the panic, the shame, the realization. The memory no longer brought anger, it brought clarity. I understood now that the Americans had not only built weapons that won the war, they had built systems that sustained life. They had conquered not just with firepower, but with organization, with a belief that care and control were not opposites but parts of the same strength. They had learned that a nation is only as powerful as its ability to care for its people, even its captives. In that moment, I saw how much of our own strength had been wasted, how we had mistaken endurance for greatness and pain for honor. We had worshipped death and called it duty, while they had mastered life and called it order. The difference was not in courage, but in vision. I let the hot water run over my hands and watched the steam drift upward, soft and endless. For the first time in decades, I felt peace. The war had taught me that empires fall to bombs, but civilizations fall to ignorance. The Americans taught me that with a bar of soap.